Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be playing Order of Battle Pacific, the new turn-based war game put out by Matrix and Slytherin Games, made by the Aristocrats. I'm playing the third scenario right now in the Imperial Japanese campaign. We're driving down the Bataan Peninsula. This is part 2 of the actual videos that I've looked at this battle, the 5th video in the series. We've already broken through the main defensive line up near the north for the U.S., up here where our artillery is. We are now engaged with the Americans and the Filipinos on the southern tip of the island. Now, historically, the Bataan Peninsula fell in early April. I believe it was April 3rd or April 9th, somewhere around then. The Japanese broke through relatively quickly the main defensive lines, right around the time frame we're at, around January 22nd, January 23rd, up in the north, after some very fierce fighting. But they didn't break through the southern defensive line until April. Now, this scenario wouldn't even allow us to get to April if we tried. We could get all the way to the end of February, early March. So the time frame is going to be accelerated somewhat either way. But here we are. We're driving south. We've got several transports with troops on them, which are moving in for a landing. The Japanese actually historically landed troops in the rear of the Bataan Peninsula, hoping to basically get into the rear of the Americans and break through their defensive lines that way. That landing has failed, just absolutely catastrophically. The Japanese landed and they got quickly bottled up and were unable to break off the beachhead. So hopefully we do better than that. We've got the Americans pretty beat up, I would say. They've got some strong fortifications here on this southern line, but we've already broken through on the far right flank, as you can see here, with only a pillbox in the way, and honestly, pillboxes seem to fall pretty easily, so I would imagine we'll roll up that flank pretty quick. The one potential stumbling block is some armor here in the rear of the fort, as well as the fortress itself. We can see here the enemy has some PT boats out, so hopefully they don't try and intercept our landings. I want to say historically they did, but I can't remember exactly what happened with the Japanese landings, if there was any interference from the American PT boats or not. As you can see here, the Americans have a decent amount of artillery. They've got a battery, a heavy battery on the left. They've got a fortress battery, and then that half-track battery. So they've got a pretty good amount of artillery. Something just blew up one of our transports. I'm not sure what. Maybe it was artillery. I wasn't really paying attention, so probably should have been. But again, we're going to start rolling up the American line. They've got 2 units of tanks. One of them's badly battered. One of them is full strength, and the fortress. That's what worries me at this point. You can see here that enemy forts don't do very well versus armored cars, interestingly enough. Armored cars don't seem terribly effective against much, but they do seem to be pretty good against forts, and you can see there we quickly overran that fort with relative ease. We'll go down here, destroy the enemy tanks, or at least push them back, and continue to roll up that right flank, expanding that hole along the right there so we can drive south toward the remaining victory points. We could probably try and push past these forts and this heavy artillery, but I don't like the idea of leaving artillery in our rear. It would certainly be a foolish thing in real life to leave an enemy artillery battery in your rear that could potentially harass your supplies. And while I don't think that would be an issue in this game, it certainly would be frustrating to deal with artillery continually hammering us when we could try and silence it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and we're going to try and silence it. Meanwhile, each of our wings, which were separated by the mountains, we had an attack force on the left side of that mountain up there on the north and an attack force on the right. Each of those elements is getting very close to linking up with each other and forming one unified front as we drive down the remnants of the peninsula. You can see there we've landed our troops on the beach, and we'll move our support ship up. That's important because when you land troops on a beach, the way this game handles supply is you get supplies from cities. Well, if you're cut off from any access to a city, then you run out of supply, and you get like a little red kind of circle next to your strength number on the bottom of the counter, which means that you become incredibly ineffective in fighting because you're low on supply. The Japanese are better at fighting out of supply than the Americans, but still, you become much less effective when you lose that supply. Now, what those supply ships do is if they're adjacent to your forces, essentially if you've got a supply ship on a coastal hex right off the beach where your troops are located, or right off the beach where your troops control that land and have moved in, then that counts as you being in supply with a city. So it's a neat feature to still allow supply lines to be important, more important than, for example, in the Panzer Corps series, but without being overly done. I think one thing that would be difficult to model in a game like this that focuses on the Pacific Theater is requiring a unit to have access to a port or a city for supply. That may not always be an option. So the supply ships are an interesting little nugget in the game that allows you to play the game and play it more accurately while also holding true to the importance of supply lines there. So, as you can see here, we're continuing to attempt to roll up the enemy flank on the right. On the left, we've also begun to drive these troops back here and destroy significant amounts of enemy forces. Our landing, I wouldn't say it caught the enemy by surprise because they've got troops in that city. But unfortunately, the city looks like it's pretty well dug in against our troops, so we'll have to see. The enemy torpedo boats, however, are approaching our troop transport, so that's a bit of a concern. It's not going to do very well versus torpedo boats. Shoot. So I think what we'll do is we'll run, maybe, I don't know. Well, what we can do is we can go ahead and have our dive bomber come in. It'll drop some bombs on these enemy torpedo boats, hopefully make them less effective, maybe scatter. Meanwhile, we'll pull our supply ship off of that hex. It will cause our infantry to drop out of supply. When I was playing at the time, I didn't realize that. I'm recording this after the fact. But anyway, so it'll pull them off the supply, and they'll be without supply for a turn. But shouldn't be too much of an impact. It's just one turn, and we only see one enemy infantry unit. And we did focus on the Bushido code. That was one of the specializations we chose. And what the Bushido code does is it makes Japanese troops more effective when they're out of supply. So that should mitigate our being out of supply a bit here. We're moving our artillery up from their rear defensive positions where they were located all the way on the northern end of the peninsula previously, and moving them south. Meanwhile, we continue to attack the enemy troops as we look to expand our control across this defensive line, which is just totally unraveling for the United States and their allies at this point. I haven't launched an attack on that city on the far right because, well, at the moment, they're just too dug in for us to have much chance, and many of our troops are disorganized. So we'll wait on that. We'll just slowly isolate them and make them less effective. And I think that's going to about do it. We have some artillery we can drop on this city, which I'll do again. Hopefully to disorganize them somewhat, so if they do attack our troops, they're less effective. I also moved our infantry off the hex that was adjacent to the enemy troops in that city. So if the enemy does attack, they'll have to abandon the city, which then would allow us potentially to take it. So you can see here, one of those patrol boats has gone back out to sea, perhaps because they're scared of our fighter bombers. Meanwhile, the other patrol boat has closed in with our support ships and launched a torpedo strike against it. Fortunately, only sinking one of the five, or only destroying one of the five strength points, or what have you. So waiting for the Allied turn to finish up here. You can see the enemy's still fighting pretty fiercely, doing pretty well to withstand our ferocious assaults. You can see that fort just finished off that infantry unit of ours, so we're definitely losing some casualties, unfortunately. We've got about 3 more objective cities we need to take in order to win. Meanwhile, we'll bring our fighter bombers in here against these torpedo craft, so they become less of a threat. And as you can see here, the enemy has troops in this city along the coast as well. So our landing force is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, but at least that bombing run and the withdrawal of the other PT boat means we can pretty safely move our supply ships back adjacent to our landing and get those guys back into supply once this turn ends. Meanwhile, we're looking to destroy the enemy howitzer battery here with fire from 3-4 sides. Okay, there you can see just an example of the difference between a troop fighting in a river hex and on a land hex. You can see immediately went from a 1-to-1 casualty ratio to 2-to-1 in favor of the attacker. Meanwhile, we've now got the Filipino troops in this city surrounded. Granted, cities do draw supply, so that won't really have any noticeable impact, but it is what it is. And again, we continue expanding our line along the center of the southern portion of the Bataan Peninsula, destroying another enemy unit, another anti-aircraft unit. Would have liked to have done that sooner, as one of their anti-aircraft units did shoot our strategic bombers down just a turn or so ago. But it is what it is, and we're at where we're at. All right, if we can purchase some units to replace the ones we've lost. We don't have a ton of money. You can see here one thing that I haven't mentioned yet in the game is the fact that when you lose a unit, it goes into this kind of casualty pool, which allows you to raise it back up again. So rather than having to completely raise new units, it's an interesting idea which allows you essentially to take your troops that have died and reformat that unit. So for example, let's say, and the units aren't numbered, but let's say the 3rd Infantry Division is destroyed. You can go ahead and recreate the 3rd Infantry Division. I suppose the game is simulating remnants of that division being formed into it, and you keep 5% of the experience of the original unit. Not a ton of experience, but it sure beats starting a unit out with no experience. Again, it's kind of the idea of reforming a unit that's been destroyed with the elements of the unit that might still be effective and alive. And I really like that approach. It's certainly, I wouldn't say it's unique because Rome Total War does it, but I wonder if maybe the developers, I wonder if the aristocrats maybe borrowed from Rome Total War or were inspired by Rome Total War, because that's exactly what Rome Total War does. Rome Total War 2 and Rome Total War Attila, if a unit's destroyed, you can raise it again, and it gets all of the kind of accolades or the history of the unit as it came before. It doesn't keep the experience of the units, but it does keep some of the perks of the units. So again, if a legion's destroyed, you can re-raise it and reform it. It's kind of like, you know, if the 1st Infantry Division was destroyed well, no, better example, the 2nd Union Infantry, well, not 2nd Infantry, sorry, I can't even speak today. The 2nd Union Corps during the Civil War ends up getting largely destroyed during the Battle of Gettysburg, or Chancellorsville. It acted as a rear guard, and then Gettysburg, or a division of it did, and then Gettysburg, the division gets absolutely, massacred. It does very well for itself, but it loses very heavily for doing so well. And then it gets reformed, and other units are consolidated into it, so that by the time of the Wilderness, the Corps is the largest corps in the army, despite being one of the smaller ones after Gettysburg. So something kind of similar to that, although a little bit different, because obviously there were not single small units, there were entire corps of divisions with very experienced men. So maybe that's a bad example, and that whole little spiel was for naught. But anyway, so that's one interesting feature that I like about it. I've really fallen in love with this game. It's a very well put together, seems very reliable. I haven't had any issues with stability, and just a game that's impressed me in almost every regard so far. And I'm 6-7 hours into it, and yeah, I'm loving every minute of it. I haven't really played as the Americans yet. I played as them when I had Defend Pearl Harbor, the very first mission I played. I didn't much care for that approach. I don't feel like Pearl Harbor is a good starting point, and I'm not going to bring this up in every single video, I swear. This is probably the last time I'll bring it up. I don't think Pearl Harbor is a very good starting point for a Allied campaign. I think it should probably start somewhere around Guadalcanal or the Coral Sea, or somewhere around then when the Allies are ready to counterpunch. That's kind of how the Panzer Corps and Allied Corps games went. That's how Panzer General and Allied General went. And I think that would be more appropriate, because I do think games like this are much more suited to the defense than to the offense, than they are to the defense. But it is what it is, and all aside from that, I've loved pretty much every single aspect of this game. So you can see here, this video I'm not talking really as much about history, I'm talking more about the gameplay, as we're now, almost 15 minutes in. We're driving here on the other side of the map, on the west side of the map, almost linked up with our troops who landed. Interestingly enough, these Japanese Marines are not good for much. It seems like no matter what, if they move up to an enemy unit, they can't do any damage. So, yay, they landed behind enemy lines, and they suck. So, yeah. But anyway, they've been linked up with our troops from the north now. They've got a clear line of supply, so that supply ship is less important. And as we attempt to reduce the enemy fortress and the city here on the western coast, one thing I would really like the game to do is I would really like the game to include city names. Maybe they can throw that in with a patch. It's hard, you know, especially when your objective is take X city by a certain date. It can be... let's see here. Infantry brigade stormed the stronghold on Mount Samat. Some of the heavy guns have been captured and can be used against their former bosses. All right, so you can see here, if you take the fort in the Philippines with your infantry, then you actually will take the fort and be able to use it against the Americans. So that's kind of cool, being able to capture a fortress and use it against them. I really like that. That's interesting. After we absolutely bombarded the crap out of it with our heavy artillery. But as I was saying, going back to what I was saying, it's not always clear what city you're supposed to take. Yes, the map is well delineated, that there's a little gold indicator over the target objective, but it's not always clear what the secondary, you know, a lot of times the secondary objective is take this city by a certain date. Well, what city am I supposed to take? It doesn't tell me on the map. And I think it would add a little bit more appeal to the game. It would make it feel more alive if there were real city names on there. I know they're represented, that's not a word. I know they're represented on the map, but again, it's not always clear what exactly I'm doing and why. You can see here the enemy patrol boats have badly damaged this supply ship of ours. It's still in touch with our forces, but the importance of that ship is much less now that we've had those troops come down from the north and link up with our Marines. So, we're what, 20 turns in? We need to, we did obtain one of our secondary objectives, is destroy the fortress guns with infantry. So essentially, we assaulted the forts with infantry, took the guns over, and that was a minor secondary objective of ours. And now you can see here we're able to bombard these troops from a distance and, use that fort as another artillery piece, at least so long as the enemy remains in range of it. That's one drawback for a fortification gun like that, is the fact that it can't move. So that is a downside. These heavy artillery guns have been incredibly useful. The 150s or 240s or what have you, but they've really been helping break apart the center of this line, especially that fort. They really solidified our hold on that and allowed the infantry to assault with great success. Meanwhile, we've got our 75mm guns on the other corner of the map, kind of pounding at this enemy city to keep their heads down while our infantry slowly reduces this enemy pillbox. We've got another mountain in the south of the Philippines, so, while the northern defenses were broken up by a mountain range or a mountain, the southern defenses are likewise in trouble. Granted, the defenses were placed north of the mountain, but it is going to split our advance up into two wings and make things more difficult to advance quickly. One of the things that I've been thinking about as I kind of talk through this and play through this is, while historical dates and facts and all of that are very interesting to me, and I think to a lot of my viewers, that isn't really the crux of history. It's history as we know it today. When you think history in school, you think, okay, memorizing name, dates, facts, things like that. But you don't really think about what the discipline really is, and that's more of a analytical understanding of why people do the things they do, and what it means to be human, really. I mean, those are the types of things that history is really about. What is the human experience, studying the human experience. Why do humans make the choices that they do? Why do we do the things that we do? How do our decisions affect others? History is a lot deeper than just knowing what happened. Knowing what happened is kind of the least effective way to try and understand history. Sure, you know what happened, but what does that mean? How do you put greater meaning to it? And I wonder how I could do a better job of communicating that in my videos, because I think that's really a stereotype that a lot of people have about history, and I think it's because of the way history is taught at the middle school and high school level. There's nothing wrong with knowing facts and what have you. I mean, they're the foundation for understanding history, but history isn't about names, dates, and facts. Those are just the topics of discussion, really. So, that's something I think would be an interesting way or an interesting topic for a video or a series of videos, is kind of what happened, but more importantly, what does it mean? Why did it happen? Why did these things occur? And less what actually occurred, if that makes sense. I hope I'm making sense and not rambling. But, I mean, that's kind of one of those things that's been on my mind quite a bit, and not just lately. I mean, I may have mentioned it in previous videos, but I always wonder, you know, why is history seemingly the least respected of the humanities disciplines? And I think part of it is because of that. People just think, well, what's the point? You're just memorizing what happened. But that's really not the point. That misses the point of history altogether. And I wonder if there might be a better way to communicate that to people, to teach that to people, and to maybe better people because of that. Because again, it's very little to do with why did they happen. I know I keep kind of coming back to this, but just something I've been thinking about now recently and for quite a long time, to be honest. Anyway, as you can see here, we've destroyed the enemy torpedo boats, PT boats, but it looks like the enemy probably has a submarine somewhere in the water because they just sank our troop transport, unless that was a coastal artillery battery, which is possible as well. I didn't really see where that came from. The Bataan Peninsula guarded the entrance to Manila Bay, or actually it does guard the entrance to Manila Bay. The peninsula hasn't gone anywhere. So Manila, which is this great fortress well, not fortress, but this great port city for the United States in this time period, is an absolute critical center of commerce. And in order for ships, warships, or what have you, to get into the port, they've got to sail right by the Bataan Peninsula and also the guns on that peninsula. That made it a logical place to basically put your artillery pieces to prevent the enemy from moving ships into your harbor where your fleet is based. But okay, so that's cool. We just captured an entire enemy unit of M3 Stuart tanks. They're light tanks, but I wonder if they're an upgrade over what the Japanese had. The Japanese didn't have the best armored units during World War II, and it looks like, according to the game, the event is essentially that the enemy was running low on fuel, and because of that, they had abandoned all these fine working tanks, and obviously since we're Japanese, we have all the fuel we need, in this scenario anyway, not in later scenarios, to carry the tanks on with us. So obviously a full complement of ammo. I'd be interested to see if those tanks can replace losses, though, given the fact that Japan obviously doesn't manufacture them. I wonder if we can get replacements for them, or if they just slowly bleed away and die and you can't do anything about that. I guess we'll find that out, hopefully not too soon, though. I'd rather they not lose casualties and we use them effectively, but we'll find out. Anyway, we've broken through the last of the enemy defensive line here in the north. We're moving south toward that last mountain on the edge of the Bataan Peninsula. Meanwhile, the Americans look like they have some pretty high-quality units here. I don't know what the half U.S. star, half other star means. But anyway, so the enemy's moving forward with some high-quality infantry to blunt our assault on the left. I wonder if they'll actually have the manpower to stop us on the right, however. One more pillbox stands in our way here. We'll just quickly reduce that, and there you go. It's destroyed. And we're continuing the advance south. Moving those tanks. Gotta get our artillery south as well. We're going to be running fairly tight, I think, on the deadline. We've got to get to 30 turns. We've got to try and take the entire peninsula before 30 turns for one of our secondary objectives. So we'll see if that happens. I'm not going to probably destroy Corregidor Island. I just don't have the air power or the naval power or the amphibious troops to do that. So we'll have to leave that to the historical capitulation, which occurred about a month after the fall of the Bataan Peninsula. Corregidor Island is the little island to the south of Bataan, which was, again, a fortress with substantial equipment to block the harbor from enemy naval equipment. Speaking of the harbor, Manila Bay at this time was an important military base for the United States Navy. It based its Asiatic squadron out of there. The naval base was called, I believe it's Caveat. I could be pronouncing that wrong. Naval Airbase. And while we had mentioned in a previous video that maybe the attacks on the air units were not entirely the fault of MacArthur. The attacks on the naval facilities were probably more preventable and actually had quite long-term impacts. So the U.S. had something like 20 submarines based out of the Philippines, which you would think 20 subs being deployed would have a potential ability to stop or blunt quite a bit of enemy surface vessels. That's a lot of firepower, but there were a few things working against the Americans. One of the things working against them was their own torpedoes. They were garbage. They ran deep because of some faulty testing. Maybe we'll go into that in a later video, but essentially they were absolute garbage. Maybe 1 in 4 of them was good and would actually hit the target and destroy it, while the rest of them would basically just be duds and not work at all. Another factor was the fact that of these torpedoes, which were supposed to be state-of-the-art and were garbage, a huge amount of them were destroyed in the initial attack on Cavite Naval Base. The Japanese bombers hit a supply depot which had over 200 torpedoes in it, and they all went up in smoke. And while 200 doesn't sound like a lot, I mean, that's 10 torpedoes right there for every single submarine there. That's almost a full complement of torpedoes, almost a full reload for the entire Asiatic fleet. So this large supply of torpedoes in the Western Pacific is destroyed, and at this time torpedoes are incredibly expensive, incredibly modern, some of the most state-of-the-art weapons available. They're very expensive, production is very slow, and the U.S. would be suffering from torpedo shortages for quite some time into the war, really until 43, which didn't hurt them too much in the sense that the torpedoes were pretty bad, but still, a bad torpedo is better than no torpedo at all when it comes to trying to sink enemy ships. In fact, some of the U.S. subs, some of the older S-boats, actually re-equipped their torpedoes with the old Mark 10 torpedo, which was a steam torpedo which left little bubbles up in the wake of where it would go, which would give away the submarine's position. However, it was a much more reliable torpedo, so there was kind of a trade-off there. But that essentially meant that the torpedo was so short supply that they weren't even being put on all of the submarines. And when I say that the torpedoes were state-of-the-art, I mean it. Essentially, they were guarded, the gyroscopes and whatnot were guarded with armed guards, much in the way that the nuclear football would be guarded today. In many sense, it was the Navy's equivalent to the Norden bomb site, which was considered a national treasure and a secret that had to be protected at all costs. Unfortunately, in both cases, neither of the weapons was quite as good as they were advertised to be. The Norden bomb site was probably better, but that's neither here nor there. That's just me rambling. So we're going to move beyond rambling now. As we can see here, we're closing in on the end of the game. 5 more turns to take the objective point that I need to take, but the enemy is slowly being worn down. They've definitely thrown a wrench in our plans on the western side of this island, deploying 3 full-size American units, 1 heavy weapons unit, been inflicting pretty substantial casualties on our troops, and forming almost another defensive line here at the southern end of the peninsula. It doesn't seem like the eastern end of the peninsula has much to be worried about, however, as the Americans and Filipino troops are still getting overrun and not putting up too much of a resistance against us. We're moving down the main roadways here into the, I think this is like Maldives. I don't even know the name of the city. I could look it up on a map, but that's why I would love for the game to show me what the name of the city was, so I wouldn't have to do that. Meanwhile, we're continuing to advance along that eastern coast on the map and meeting with mostly success so far. So this video probably will go to the end of this particular scenario. I know my videos in this series have been a little bit longer, typically in the 40 to 45 minute to 48 minute range, but that's just because that's kind of how things are broken up. This was actually one video that I split into 2, so it is what it is. Anyway, working on breaking through these stalwart American defenders on the left so far, not going all that well. We've certainly reduced their effectiveness and shattered their units, but they still haven't broken and are putting up pretty fierce resistance, although I'm hopeful that next turn we can break through finally. So I was just briefly taking a look at Japanese tank production, kind of shifting gears again, and I was kind of curious, you know, why did Japan have such a poor tank force during World War II? And I think the answer is more obvious than you would otherwise think. Japan in 1938 actually had the 5th largest tank force in the world. They had over 1,060 tanks, which would largely compare pretty favorably to the early war tanks in Germany even. 35mm main guns, light armor, machine guns, you know, no sloping armor, more boxy designed, kind of based off French designs, but still, that's kind of what the Germans had around the same time as well. Japanese tank production peaked in 1942, but by 1945 it was down to under 300 units. And 1944, that is. And if you actually look at the tank designs, they really don't advance much beyond what they had in early 1940, 1941, kind of the 38 period. So the Japanese were building a large modern tank force, and they were using it largely in China. But once the war with the United States started, there was really limited opportunities for them to employ tanks against the U.S. They did employ tanks pretty wide scale in their initial invasions of Burma and their attempts to drive into India, where tanks would be useful against the British. But again, most of those early drives were early in the war, or they were fighting through jungles where tank warfare wasn't as practical as it was in Europe. So if you look at what Japan had at the start of the war, again, it would compare pretty favorably to where Germany was at in 1939. The difference was when Japan went to war with the major powers, they didn't have a whole lot of opportunities to use those tanks against the major powers. They primarily used the tanks during the period before the war when they were fighting the Chinese. So the Germans, as they're fighting the Russians, the French, and the British, need to continue developing more and more modern tanks because of Europe's terrain and the fact that it was principally a land fight. As the war escalated in the Pacific, it was principally a naval fight. You'd have large naval engagements, large air engagements, and as a result, the priorities were different. The Japanese didn't have a whole lot of important need for armored warfare. It certainly would help to have tanks on the beaches. In fact, the Japanese designed several pretty modern tank designs toward the end of the war with the goal of using them against the American Sherman tanks, which the Americans were using in small numbers when they would invade the islands. But all in all, there weren't a whole lot of opportunities to use those tanks against the Americans, and it took a back seat. Japanese resource priorities went to their Air Force and went to their Navy, which is logical. So as a result, tank productions declined. Not just tank production, though. As the priorities shifted, so too did the use of tanks, and so too did the design of tanks. The tanks that they had were kept, and they were utilized, but the tanks that they were looking at getting just kind of ended up being more the same. They made some designs, but they didn't really have a purpose in fighting the Americans when, the main issue fighting the Americans was the lack of Japanese naval success against the Americans or the lack of Japanese air success against Americans. So investing in tanks wasn't really all that wise or all that necessary. And that's why you end up hearing, thinking of Japan kind of in negative terms when you think about their armor, is that because from 1941 until 1945, they really were secondary weapons against the American and British war efforts, which were principally naval wars. And the Japanese prioritized logically to focus heavily on a naval program and an air program. So, while the Japanese tank force was modern at the outbreak of the war, changing priorities decimated Japanese tank research and slowed it, as well as Japanese tank production. Again, they did design several prototypes, which would have been probably pretty favorable when rated against the U.S. tanks, but they didn't end up having the need that would allow them to justify spending the kind of resources they needed to get those tanks into full production. Not when the Navy was doing as poorly as it was late in the war, and when the Air Force was as well. Alright, so that's enough talking about the Japanese tank production here. You can see we've got a fighter aircraft that is low on fuel, but we did just recently take an airbase, so we should be able to get it there next turn, or once this turn ends, and hopefully finish off things pretty soon. The Americans have one heavy weapons unit. Looks like they've got a lot of understrength units. They've got some anti-aircraft units, but the goal is to take the last objective by the end of the 30th turn in order to get what seems to be a major victory. The game doesn't specifically say when things are major or minor victories, but it seems logical that a victory in which we obtain that secondary objective of winning within 30 turns would be considered a major victory. Anyway, here it's pretty much a foregone conclusion as we close in on these last few objectives that we will win this battle. It's just a matter of whether we get there by the end of the 38th turn. You can see there's that one more objective there with the gold flag that we've got to go ahead and take. We've got some artillery I'd like to bring in and get a little bit closer so it can take part in the action, and infantry in general needs to get over there as well. Meanwhile, on the western end of the map, we're all about to have one kind of giant link up. It kind of reminds me of when the Russian and the two Russian armies linked up during the Stalingrad campaign when they encircled the Germans, and they had these two armies rush together and cheer and what have you as they came together as one. It almost seems like we're going to do that, except the difference is the enemies are already going to be defeated, so I have to imagine it'll be a little bit less emotional for the soldiers involved. But there you have it. We defeated that enemy unit here in the north with our armor, and then we've just got one heavy enemy weapons unit left, one American heavy weapons unit left, a couple of infantry stragglers, and then Corregidor Island, but we're not going to end up dealing with Corregidor. We just aren't going to have the time, because I'd like to try and get it all finished up here by the end of turn 30, and Corregidor would certainly take several more turns than that. We'd probably get it done before turn 40, though. Right now, each turn seems to represent one day, so we're into early February of 1942. When it looks like Bataan will fall. And that would still leave Corregidor, if it lasts, another month, that would still be there until middle to early April. So about a month ahead of schedule versus what actually happened here. We will obtain, if we win in the next two turns, we will accomplish two of our goals, two of our secondary goals, in addition to both of our primary goals. So I would say that's a pretty good achievement when you only have 3 total secondary goals. Don't have a whole lot more to add or say at this point. You know, conversation's kind of difficult to throw anything in here with maybe 2 minutes left in the actual video. So really at this point, while we're finishing mopping up of the enemy forces, just want to thank you guys for tuning in once again. It really means a lot to me, the fact that you guys are here almost every single time. I get a great turnout. I'm almost always happy with the results and the views, and I don't do it for the views, but it's very reassuring to see them. You know, to get that kind of support from your fans means a lot to me. So definitely appreciate it, guys. I wanted to thank you for tuning in each and every video, or even if you don't tune in every video. There's several people I've seen who are big supporters of the Buzz Aldrin Space Program Manager series, which I'd like to return to, and then also the Commander series, and several people have said they're going to be very loyal to this series as well. So, you know, we're already 5 in. Again, I'm recording this just as the first one went live today, so we'll see how the series pans out. But I appreciate all the loyalty you guys show me, and everything you do in the comments and all of that. It really means quite a bit to me, and I just want to thank you there. Meanwhile, you can see here we're finishing off the enemy, and should be just about done. There you go. A swift strike. The Emperor is pleased with our swift victory over the Philippines. Now our forces can be shipped away to deal with the Dutch East Indies, essentially, here. We're going to go ahead and finish off this enemy anti-aircraft gun, and then we'll end the turn with that one fortress gun, and should be a major victory. There it is, a victory. The entire enemy defense has collapsed, clogging the roads with refugees fleeing troops. Their commanders have realized the futility of further resistance and capitulated to our forces. Bataan Death March incoming. Obviously, thankfully, we don't play that part of the game. Anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in. Until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.